Thank you for choosing this Analyst Insight podcast from the Information Security Forum. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about threat intelligence, a topic that we last touched on back in 2017. And you told us it was high time that we looked at it again, and we agree, and that's exactly what we're going to do. My name's Paul Watts, I'm Distinguished Analyst of the ISF, and I'm joined here in the studios in London by Max Brook, Research Analyst, and the man leading the charge on this project. Say hello, Max.
Hello, Paul.
Hello. Mark Ward, who is our Senior Research Analyst and former BBC journalist.
Hello, Paul.
And on the line, we also have Gareth Hacken, who is our Principal Analyst, our Standards Guru. And Gareth, I think your military background, as we'll no doubt discuss shortly, hugely relevant to this topic. It's great to have you with us. I think this is the first time I've done a podcast with you.
Yeah, it is, Paul. Yeah, it's good to be here. It's an interesting topic, and it's one I'm sure we'll dive into in some detail.
Great. Well, gents, you're very welcome, and thank you for taking the time out. So without further ado, let's move on to Threat Intelligence, the podcast, which is very dramatic, but that's what someone put in my calendar. So we'll go from that. So let me just set the scene a little bit. If I go back a few years ago when I was still out in the field, it kind of felt to me like threat intelligence was very much a luxury item for most organisations, very expensive, or it was there to answer a specific question, or it was there in response to something that may have happened to the organisation in the past. And mostly it was very decoupled, very insular standalone team that wasn't really part of the security operation as such. If you think about where we are now, think about the last couple of years, well, where are we? We've got an increasingly large digital economy. We have a threat landscape that changes about as regularly as the wind changes direction. And the time between a threat surfacing and a threat becoming a reality is shortening dramatically so. So maybe threat intelligence has come of age, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. And I guess, Max, this is what's driving us to revisit the topic. So I was wondering whether you'd give us a little bit of detail and insight into, why the members have asked us to think about and revisit this. Give us a bit of a retrospective on the previous paper and where we think we want to take that to the next level. And we'd love to hear about, your journey so far in terms of putting the research together.
Sure. Kind of as you mentioned, we have a back catalogue of many reports over, all the years ISF has been researching different areas. And threat intelligence came up because I think in the last 5 or so years since the original report was released in 2017, that it's kind of changed from that vanity project sort of commodity to actually something which is slightly more grounded. But the original report reflected that. It took a more academic, theoretical view of intelligence, the history, the cycle, and all those kind of aspects of it. But I think the questions the members are asking now is a bit more about, how do I actually implement this? How do I build or manage my team? What do I need to consider? And I'm looking for that more kind of practical advice and side to it. So that's what we're trying to keep at the core, what intelligence is, because I think that's important, but trying to ground it a little bit more and tie it down to something a bit more tangible for members. So the members really starting to recognise that there's a value here, but not really knowing how to go about it, and probably trying to avoid the idea of just going and buying something off the shelf and then thinking, well, what do I do with that, right? Yeah, I think one of the main challenges that kind of arose in the first report and is still around now is, what is threat intelligence? What is intelligence? It's very loosely defined, and we're just trying to clarify that a little bit more and kind of focus on what it isn't as well. So when, as it's kind of bubbling back up again and becoming a buzzword, as some might say, just trying to actually outline its values and what it can actually be used for, but what it also can't be.
Do you think that's the stigma that it's had in the past? And I, Mark, you might, and Gareth, you may have a view on this as well, where threat intelligence was maybe last week's zero trust, where it was a bit of a buzzword and it was glamorized, and people were trying to clamor over themselves to make some sense of it or buy it anyway to be one step in front. Is it something that's finally reached the maturity, perhaps?
I'm not sure it's maturity as such as desperation, really. I think because certainly in the early days when I was a sort of cub reporter writing about viruses and threats, then the good moment was when you identified the hacker or, the malicious hacker behind the virus. I mean, there's some quite famous ones. Sven Jashin, who did Sasa, David L. Smith, Word Macros, and then Chris Bile, who did Pathogen and Queeg, which Red Dwarf fans will recognise. And then it got much nastier because it got organised. So it's organised crime got involved. So I think it's threat intelligence is the only way you survive, because you have to work out which threats are going to trouble you, because those ones way back when, they were a nuisance, really. It wasn't quite a gentlemanly trade, but they did it because they wanted to get their name out one way or another, rightly or wrongly, probably wrongly in those cases. So I think now they need to understand this, because it can help them. It will make a difference to how they secure their organization.
And I guess we've got a bit of a sprawl now as well, right? I mean, in the good old days, it was simple. You had a data center, you had a server in the data center, you had someone sat at a desk. You kind of knew the limits of what you needed to worry about. Nowadays, we've got cloud infrastructure, we've got Internet of Things, we've got convergence of information and operational technology assets. And I think that probably makes an incredibly challenging to understand exactly where the next threat's going to come from. We've made that a little bit broader than we're used to.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more threats. I think that's just the other thing as well. Just you need a way to sift. There's been some good presentations at Congress on this, just the sheer number of issues organizations have to cope with, and you need a good filtering system, and threat intelligence has got to be part of that for sure. But it's not just a feed that they throw at you. There's got to be some intelligence on your side. I mean, that's to work out what you should pay attention to.
I think as well, it's called threat intelligence. It sounds sort of out there, kind of a sexy kind of thing, which is not something necessarily you'd associate with security a lot of the time. But
what are you saying? You're sexy.
Yeah,
come on.
Well, I can't see it.
Perfect voice, perfect body for radio.
Absolutely.
But no, that it's kind of the barriers are being broken down a little bit. You see in the media now, there's a lot more public discourse and understanding about what are these threats and what this intelligence is actually trying to do. It's not just a platform or a feed coming in. It's understanding that this is actually about just clarifying decisions, and whether that be tactical or strategic, short-term, long-term, it's just about improving, and it's one piece of the puzzle. It's not a panacea or a crystal ball for future gazing and navel gazing, but it's useful. But I think it's certainly been, matured and just distilled down a bit, kind of.
Just on the subject of that, Gareth, in the work that you and the team have been doing in terms of evolving our standards, evolving our risk management methodologies, are you finding that bigger attack surface and that bigger threat landscape has caused you to adapt our work in a slightly different way than maybe 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. The first one, I think it suffers from a bad reputation generally, in just the word intelligence. And I think you can probably trace that back to the Iraq War. There was such a massive kind of, possibly rightly so in some respects, there was such a media storm around the intelligence failures. And it's something used daily to, in the military and in national intelligence services to keep people safe. And there's a lot of good things that it does. But when it goes wrong, you really kind of hear about it. And I think there's probably a little bit of a bad reputation thing going on, which, as we come further and further away from that particular incident, I think that probably dies away. I think people are realizing, and organizations are realizing, that you can do this internally. You don't necessarily have to pay hundreds of thousands of pounds to buy a product off the shelf. And I think, as Max said, they're looking for more practical implementations, which obviously is why we've revisited the workshop. In terms of the standard good practice, we've had something on it for the last 3 versions, so starting in 2018, and ISO have now included it in 27002 as well. So it is something that is, in the industry is gaining prominence. And I think that the report in 2017, I think it hit the right note. It was partly kind of demystification as well. And I think at the time that was important, but I think moving it on, as we're doing with Max's report, I think is valid, definitely.
You talk about, let's come back to the whole topic of the military and its use of intelligence. We talk about threat intelligence in our world, up until very recently being a bit of a luxury item, but the reality is intelligence has a grounding in the world of military and has served a useful and dare I say fascinating purpose for many years prior to that. And I'm interested in what we can learn from the experiences of the military's use of threat intelligence over the years. So I just wonder whether you could share with us, some of your thoughts, Gareth, on how the intelligence cycle works, to ensure that military chiefs are getting maximum benefit from that intelligence, both in peacetime and in conflict? I know that's a very broad question, but I'd really be interested in your insight.
Yeah, I think the key point is a process. It needs to be a very well-defined process. And I think in terms of the military and the police as well, and that they do use intelligence in different ways, but they still kind of have a very mature process. And the reason for that is it's about sort of lives and life and death. And it's sorry to lower the tone, but it is about kind of saving lives. It's about winning battles, and it's such a powerful element as well. It can lead to very kind of asymmetric warfare in that one very small body or unit of people can beat a much larger body of people in terms of technology, in terms of numbers, just by knowing their intentions and knowing what that kind of that army or that military body is going to do. I also think there's some crossover with crypto as well. If you kind of want to look at the history of intelligence, look at the history of crypto, and that goes back to I read something the other day about in the Greek Persian wars about shaving servants' heads, tattooing messages on them, and then letting their hair grow back and having them kind of deliver that message, which is great if you've got sort of 2 or 3 months. But it just gives the idea that there's information there that needs protecting, and that is obviously of value to a malicious actor. So I think the other thing that there is a difference. I think in the military and the police, there's a much more of an emphasis on human intelligence, which in a commercial world isn't really as a kind of a thing. I appreciate, you get kind of industrial espionage and things like that, but there is more emphasis on that kind of that human element. But yeah, I mean, it's fantastically important, certainly in terms of national intelligence services, military intelligence, police intelligence. And the biggest example is probably the Enigma machine. I mean, arguably that won World War II for the Allied forces. So yeah, you can see that as a massive intelligence win in that particular war. So yeah, incredibly important. I think it just goes back to having that mature process, that cycle, and that's something we pulled out in the 2017 report.
Yeah, and look, I'm going to give a shameless plug for Bletchley Park. I mean, the story of Enigma is absolutely fascinating. And, if you wanted to do anything with your security teams, you could do a lot worse than take yourself off to Bletchley Park, put yourself in that story and really immerse yourself in how, signals and intelligence and the way that they could be intercepted, understood, interpreted and turned kind of back against themselves. I mean, it shortened the war, it saved countless lives. And, it inspires you when you think about that story in the context of what we're trying to do as cybersecurity professionals and, the CISOs and budget holders out there who are trying to think about how they can upsell the idea of threat intelligence into their organizations, kind of thinking about those outcomes. I think that's probably something, not wishing to make your job any harder, Max, but we should really think about that why and how you can build that business case for it. But it shouldn't be a solution looking for a problem, right? I don't know whether you come across anything to do with this in the early research.
Yeah, I think if you take that view towards it, you end up just creating more problems than you originally had. I think it's that age-old problem of signals versus noise. And if you start loading more and more noise in, then you just become swamped. And even those signals you might have been seeing before having any sort of intelligence capability, you lose them as well. So I think what has really been clear early on is having a very, very direct and well understood across the business strategy and goal of why you are taking this.
Has to be said as well, the media doesn't help on that noise side either, because I think that a lot of CISOs get questions about, I've seen this in the media, are we vulnerable? And suddenly you've got an issue to solve. But if you've got that good threat intelligence, what's going to affect you. You can say no quite quickly and stamp on that particular request. There was a really interesting company I spent quite a bit of time talking to just before I stopped being a BBC tech reporter, called Grey Noise, which was trying to get at all those threats that are just swirling around the internet and that kind of background noise of nastiness. And those, if you didn't know that they were always there for everybody, the static in the pipe kind of thing, then you would start reacting to those, but you don't need to. You can quite easily tune those out. So I think, it's important to focus in on the things that are really going to cause you problems. Yeah.
I think this is a really important point, actually. you know, being able to use something like threat intelligence in an organization is in similar to a lot of more advanced tooling and capabilities in cybersecurity. It has to be built on a foundation of cognizance and knowledge. You know, there is no point in bringing threat intelligence into an organization unless you can contextualize that and bring some value to it. And it kind of leads me on to a point that you just touched on, Mark, and I like to come back to the adage of a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. So, you know, we know and we recognize that the world of digital has expanded into facets of everybody's lives. You know, you can't escape it. It's all around us. So cybersecurity has moved from a niche topic that's the behest of industry to a mainstream one that's important and relevant to everybody. And it affects everyone whether they like it or not. And, you know, as you said earlier, it can be a little bit sexy sometimes, it can be a little bit scary to the untrained and uneducated and uninformed. And therefore, it's something that can be sensationalized. It's something that can sell stories. It can sell newspapers. It can attract audiences. It can generate. It can just generate fear, uncertainty, and doubt in society. And we've just spent the last 2 years having to debunk and demystify, and this is really important, I think, in the context of threat intelligence. The mainstream media loves a good cyber story. And, you know, to your point, Mark, I think CISOs around the world groan every time, you know, a red top or a media runs a story that's not 100% factually correct, waiting for that phone call from the CEO to go, oh my God, I've just watched this. What does it mean? You know, what do we need to do? So, Mark, I'm giving you the dubious task of defending media now, but all joking aside, you know, what part does the media have to play here? And have we seen exploitation of threat intelligence, or those streams of data and noise by PR teams and security vendors and end user corporations? And additionally, you know, how does the media help or hinder the cause when we're trying as a society to separate fact from friction and drive the right responses? There's a lot there to unpack, I'm afraid.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Welcome.
So I think with the media, there's a lot of misunderstanding out there, and it has to be said that often stories are written because the headline is thought of first, and then they fit the facts around that. And I think there is a lot of misrepresentation because people don't know. And I think you can, as a journalist, you can get away with hiding the details if it makes a good story. And I'm sure I'm absolutely positive that happens. But I think as well that my experience was that there was a lot of tech companies who used information about threats to make themselves look good. There was definitely a PR arm of a lot of security companies who were interested in telling you about the latest, greatest threat that as they saw it. And the job was to poke through that and see if actually there was anything behind it. And often there wasn't. And as well, we did get targeted by a lot of hacker groups who were trying to use us as a way to recruit. So they'd claim responsibility for an attack and say, see how dangerous we are, see, look what we did. And it was obviously they didn't. But all they wanted to do was then say, look, we got quoted by the BBC or whoever, or CNN, and then they could charge more for their services or just, you know, stand higher in that, you know, rather grubby pool of malicious hackers. So yeah, I think it's got a bit better because there is a bit more information out there, and there are some tech journalists who do a good job. But yeah, I think it's an unfortunate day when a CISO gets that call from the CEO saying, I saw this on the 6 o'clock news, or saw this on wherever, and, you know, tell me we're safe from that, and you have to do it again. I don't know that's necessarily going to change because it's just the world we live in, unfortunately, and that, you know, the news cycles are pretty short these days.
So I guess when it comes to making the judgment call as to when the time is right for threat intelligence to become a part of your cybersecurity posture, dare I call it that, there's influences that maybe force the issue. And I just wanted to maybe come back to something that Gareth said a little bit earlier on. Let me frame this in the right way. So there's not often time goes by in our industry when we're having to deal with a new fad, zero trust, SASE, CASB, cloud, you know, and it's hard to separate the fad and the fashionista from the relevance and the need to apply new technologies, new customs and practices. So, you know, on the basis that we've come to the conclusion that we believe that threat intelligence is coming of age, and Max's research is going to dive into that in a little bit more detail in terms of, you know, what are the prerequisites, when the time is right, how should you go about it, and that's all great. We've also got some regulatory catalysts in the mix. So Gareth, just turning back to yourself. So we've seen the addition of threat intelligence controls coming into the 2022 release of ISO 27002. So that means that, if we go on previous experiences, we've got about 2 years before they're enforceable through 27001 Annex A. And I guess that the real risk, therefore, is that organisations who are maybe, dare I say, prioritising compliance over doing the right thing to drive maturity are going to reach into the marketplace and buy threat intelligence as a service, as a commodity, just because they want to tick the regulatory box. Now, I have a personal opinion on that. I think that's a daft and ridiculous idea, especially when you go back to what you were saying, Mark, a little bit earlier on, in that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So bringing threat intelligence into your organisation without the capacity to understand and interpret it, that actually creates a problem for CISOs. Okay, so Gareth, in terms of your thoughts on this in the context of regulation, I'd be interested in your views in terms of how organisations need to recognise that this is coming into management systems now. It's been in the SOGP for a while, as you said, but when's the right time, or are we about to see another case of the tail wagging the dog?
Yeah, it's a good point. So, like you said, normally it's kind of 2 to 3 years. I don't know what ISO's current stance on this is. I've heard 3 years, but yeah, I think 2 to 3 years is a good kind of estimate. That it will be in Annex A, and that will be it. It's kind of, at the minute you can use either 2013 or 2022. So yeah, it will be hitting in the next couple of years. Yeah, I think we'll probably see a bit like GDPR, whereas we got closer to the was it May 18th? I can't remember the exact date, but as we got closer to that date, people got more and more kind of concerned and started kind of grasping at straws a little bit. Yeah, there probably will be an increase in vendors selling threat intelligence. Maybe people just kind of grasping at any kind of function, or I mean, the wording in ISO is quite loose. It's kind of, it basically says that you should be analyzing information to produce threat intelligence. So I suppose you can look at that in a couple of different ways. You can either outsource that, or you can get something going internally. I do think there's a lot to be said for open source intelligence. I do think there's a lot to be said for building your own that kind of builds along with you. Like you say, if you haven't got the capability to use this intelligence, then you are potentially creating more problems. So it does have to be kind of, it does have to be in relation to your current maturity, I think. And it comes down as well to a kind of data, and there's a few, looking at the quantitative risk stuff, data collection, how are you positioned at the minute to actually collect data, and then the next step is obviously analyzing that data. There's no point collecting reams and reams of data if you can't do anything with it. And I think it's the same with threat intelligence. There's no point going out and buying hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of product if you can't actually do anything with it. So yeah, it is an interesting point. It'd be interesting to see what happens over the next couple of years as it does seep through into Annex A and becomes part of the ISMS, and then obviously it needs to be some kind of evidence shown that you are in compliance. Yeah, so it's an interesting one, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. Like I said, I do think there is and hopefully we can touch on it a bit later, but I do think there's a lot to be said for open source intelligence, and I think that's starting to come of age as well, mainly down to the internet. And I think you can actually map the emergence of intelligence in the ways it's collected. So you start with human intelligence for the last 2,000 odd years. You come to the sort of 20th century, you start to see signal intelligence. Then you see the internet, and you start to see open source intelligence. As technology gets better and changes, you start to see different types of intelligence, and that opens it up to other people that perhaps before didn't have access to that kind of information.
It's an interesting topic, open source intelligence, and Mark and I talked about the challenge of trust in a rapidly expanding lake of data and information in Threat Horizon 2024, which is available in all good ISF Live portals, and you should download it and read it.
Absolutely.
But all that aside, do you worry at all, Gareth, about signal to noise and signal integrity in open source intelligence? I mean, there's rapidly expanding sources of that. I've heard of organisations that are even tapping into tapping into social media feeds and, you know, pulling all that into elastic search engines and trying to extrapolate data from that. Are we worried that we could be poisoning those data wells of open source intelligence and leading intelligence analysts up the garden path? You know, are they dangers? And Max, you know, is this something that maybe, you know, is a consideration in the research? What are people's views on that? Throw that open to everybody.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there that's correct. I think there's so much stuff out there in terms of open source that you could drive yourself a little bit crazy in terms of what you collect, what you trust, how you process it. Again, I think having worked in a police environment as well, there's a lot of good stuff done with open source intelligence in the law enforcement community, certainly in terms of cybercrime investigation. And yeah, social media plays a large part of that. I've known good bits of evidence be collected purely from Facebook because people are silly enough to obviously put whatever on there and not lock things down. So yeah, there is a lot out there, and again, you have to have the right kind of maturity and attitude to properly use it. But there's also a great deal of wealth within that kind of open source intelligence collection, and if it's done correctly, then there's a lot to be gained from it. I think, to be honest, reputation is probably the biggest aspect because there's so much, and the police rely heavily on this. You know, reputation of a source. Somebody could walk into a police station and say X is about to be murdered. Well, you know, who's giving you that information? What's their reputation? Are they known to have done this kind of thing before? You know, are they known to the police? You know, that kind of thing. So I think reputation is probably the biggest factor when it comes to open source intelligence.
Thanks, Gareth. Any thoughts from you, Sales Gents?
Yeah, I think obviously, as Gareth mentioned, there's a huge, enormous amount of information and data out there on the web and with open source avenues, but just collecting information and data and storing that somewhere is not intelligence. Intelligence is actually taking that, putting it in the context of the business and the stakeholder and the requirements that people have set in place and actually reporting that, you know, to the relevant audiences. So I think there needs to be an awareness that you can't just consume and consume and consume. There has to be an output to this. And like we mentioned earlier, it's that too much noise actually just reduces and kind of distills what you're actually trying to get across to the right people. So I think it's all about producing intelligence for the sake of it. It doesn't really offer value to anybody, really. It's actually, you are producing it for a consumer. And that consumer might be a senior executive or it might be somebody more operational. But at the end of the day, both those groups of people set you a requirement as an analyst or a threat intelligence capacity as a whole, and then you produce that.
Yeah. I was going to say, yeah, I think on the intelligence side, and that open source and looking at the bad guys out there, because I think in the long run, everyone makes mistakes, and that's how the bad guys are caught. I think it was the Dread Pirate Roberts from Silk Road. I think they accidentally revealed their Silk Road username in an email that somebody dug out years and years before. So I think, you know, given enough information, yeah, you can start to track these folks down. But I think it is just an avalanche of threats out there. I think that's where organizations can use this, just because they really need to know. They need to have a good sense of what is going to cause them the most issues. And I think you're right, Max. Yeah, but they need to know what to do with it once you've got that as well. Yeah,
I think you need to understand, you know, your threat landscape and where you're situated in that. You know, you have to be very, not precise it's the wrong word, but you know, have to put boundaries on it somewhere. Otherwise, it's just too much.
I mean, I'm going to second guess what the report's probably going to say here, but I think it draws some parallels to some of the briefing papers we've done on Zero Trust, which is you've got to crawl, then walk, then run. Yeah. And I think the worst thing you can do, and look, we went through this back in the days when we were trying to find our feet with log analytics and security incident and event management. You know, you can't ingest all of that data and then try and find your way with it. You know, the best thing you can do is kind of start with a question and answer that question and then learn and scale and scale and scale. And, you know, but I think, you know, getting that balance back is going to be a very important consideration for organizations that are going to take themselves on that threat intelligence journey.
Yeah, I think you can, you know, equally produce usable threat intelligence with one individual looking at, you know, open source or intelligence sharing, whether it's a government website or FSISAC or something like that.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you can have a huge cyber defense center, but at the core of it, they can do the same job, which is part of it really as a whole.
So I'm really looking forward to reading this research, and I'm sure our members are as well. This is definitely a topic that's going to run and run and run, and I'm sure we'll be having more conversations about some aspects of threat intelligence as we land the report. So best of luck with the research, Max. And as we move towards wrapping this particular conversation up, I just wonder whether we should just spend a little moment thinking about the future. Let's go all threat horizon for a minute, shall we? We love doing threat horizon stuff. Let's speculate on where we think this is going. How do we think the threat intelligence market's going to evolve? And let me give you an idea, a thought that's running through my head. We talk about cyber war, and we talk about things like artificial intelligence and machine learning. We worry about things like quantum computing when that compute power is available potentially to threat actors, blended with things like artificial intelligence, and that actually becomes an unassailable adversary. How are we going to deal with that? Are we going to fight AI with AI? How does threat intelligence play a part in that? Do you have any thoughts? And there's no wrong answer here, because we're futuristic. We're thinking about the future here.
Well,
crystal ball time.
Yeah, I think certainly with looking at viruses out there, and you could definitely see how the bad guys reacted once antivirus got decent. And instead of them getting sneakier, they just spammed out more and more viruses, and you just use that. And that's, I think, has driven a lot of the threats nowadays. It's just they see that defenses do a decent job of filtering that, so they just pound you more and more with those threats. And I don't think that's going to change. And certainly machine learning, AI, is only going to make that worse, because once you get the decent learning system in place, then it can react and pound you with even more things. And as well, the nasty part of that is that they will not look like other things, because humans make things in a very particular way, and we're very good at spotting them, but machines don't. And I think that's going to be an interesting adaptation we'll see from the threat intelligence industry. How do they pick those kind of things out?
Yeah, I think the core of it, AI will be useful in terms of the processing and the collection, but at the end of the day, intelligence remains at its core a human capital enterprise. That there has to be somebody there at the end of it. And I've spent a lot of time, sinking hours into the academic side of big data and analytics and how that improves or contributes to intelligence forecasting. And the answer was still, at the end of it, was people. So I think it's going to be interesting seeing how it develops and that relationship continues. But I don't think it ever becomes, a fully sort of computerized or, artificial intelligence driven capability.
So I was at an event last week. I like that. I just want to test a bit of a hypothesis here, or a thought, not really a hypothesis actually, that threat intelligence is a bit like penetration testing, that actually the value is when the human factor is added. In other words, maybe threat intelligence is more of an art form and less than a science.
Yeah, I'm sure Gareth will have something to say.
I was just going to say, I think you're spot on. I think it's knowledge, experience. That I don't think we're that close to Skynet, if I'm honest. I've been waiting for the last, 92 that film came out, and I don't think we're. I don't think we're a great deal closer. I think AI, like strong AI, real consciousness, is still a way off. So until that point, there'll always be a place for experience, knowledge. The subtleties of the human condition, all those different kind of things. So I'm quite optimistic about that kind of stuff. I think people adapt. So criminals adapt, the police adapt to fight them. I think in terms of the usage of AI, and quantum computing is another one. You get these kind of media-driven stories about all encryption will die, or asymmetric encryption will die. The internet will be wide open from an encryption perspective. Well, there's already people looking at things like quantum encryption that will take that on a level. So I just think technology can be used in both aspects, and people catch up. You ultimately have a bit in the middle where there might be a bit of disruption, but the good guys and the bad guys catch up with each other. So I remain quietly optimistic about things like that.
And as Gareth drops the mic and walks off into the sunset, all it remains for me to say is Max, Mark, Gareth, thanks very much for your insights. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that you out there, the listener, has enjoyed it just as much as we've enjoyed putting it together. You can find more podcasts on the ISF podcast channel or at securityforum.org, where you can also learn more about ISF research, tools and guidance. Until then, and until next time, thank you for listening. It's goodbye from us, and we look forward to talking to you again on another Analyst Insight podcast.